All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Spotlight PA's panel on reporting misconduct and internal accountability at Penn State University. My name is Wyatt Massey, and I am Spotlight PA's reporter covering Penn State. Our journalism is driven by a deep sense of public service, and it is powered by you, our readers and members. None of the work that I do, none of the work that the State College Bureau or Spotlight PA as a whole, as well as this event, our many newsletters, and our investigative journalism is possible without your support. I just want to take a moment here and ask everyone who has the means to make a gift now, and you can do that at spotlightpa.org/donate. That's spotlightpa.org/donate. And also, if you have a question for our panelists, you can drop them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to them towards the end of the program. Just a reminder that tonight's event is also being recorded for those who can't make it. In July, Spotlight PA, in partnership with the Center Daily Times, published a year-long investigation into the reforms that Penn State implemented following the Sandusky child sex abuse scandal. The newsroom specifically looked at the changes Penn State made in the past decade, including rewriting policies, emphasizing other policies, establishing new oversight offices, and changing the ways in which people can report potential wrongdoing. Our reporting found that Penn State operates with a largely decentralized series of oversight offices, which oversee various subjects and geographic areas. These units do not all follow a standardized investigative protocol, and the university does not have a centralized way to track all cases of reported misconduct. This setup results in multiple offices applying policies to more than 123,000 students and employees on 24 campuses across the state, with a limited awareness of existing problems. For example, reports can be overlooked when they get reassigned to a different office. Our reporting also found that Penn State's former chief ethics officer was repeatedly accused of misconduct over a 2-year span. People tried to report the misconduct through official channels, as well as reaching out directly to university trustees and the then president of the university. Last summer, a former ethics office employee sued the university, alleging discrimination. That case was settled out of court earlier this year. And this month, another former ethics office employee filed paperwork to sue the university for discrimination. With us tonight are two people who have pushed for greater accountability at Penn State or within higher education in general. Barry Diller is a lawyer with Diller & Solomon, who has represented clients in cases involving denial of medical care in prison, prison suicide, violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, employment discrimination, and sex discrimination and sexual assault suffered by students. Barry's work has included Title IX lawsuits against local universities, including East Stroudsburg University. Eugene DePasquale is the former Pennsylvania Auditor General. He held the position between 2013 and 2021. In 2017, his office conducted a performance audit of Penn State, which led him to call for greater transparency within the university. I do want to note that we invited officials from Penn State to be part of this panel. The university did not respond to our request. I will, though, read the statement Penn State provided in response to our project. The university said, as a predominantly decentralized, large and complex organization, the university's mechanisms for responding to reports of wrongdoing and reporting on outcomes of the university's handling of such reports have grown organically throughout its history as needs have been identified. Following internal and external examinations and audits of the university's previous practices, new policies, protocols, and people have been put into place. I know that was a lot of talking, and I'm now excited to have some of the other panelists talk. But I think a good place to start would be for each of you to kind of define the terms transparency and accountability, and how, in your opinion, these concepts should be applied to institutions of higher education. Eugene, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, first of all, thank you to Spotlight for having me, and certainly Barry, looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts as well. For starters, as the now former Auditor General, we conducted during my time in office, performance audits of both Pitt, Penn State, and Temple, along with the state system of higher education and public schools all throughout the state. But the Pitt, Penn State, and Temple audits were specifically performance audits. So they were looking at both finances and the performance of those universities into a specific range. Some of the areas that we looked at were background checks. That was obviously directly related to some of the issues with the Sandusky scandal, and we wanted to look at the universities as a whole, not just Penn State, but the other universities specifically in those areas. How state, the direct state tax dollar investments, not the federal money, not research dollars, but looking at state investments in the university, how that was utilized, for lack of a better phrase, and also a range of cooperation. So those were what we looked at. Now, it's important to note, I believe, when it comes to the state-related universities, and I want to be in full transparency here. I went and received my graduate degree from the University of Pittsburgh, and also am an adjunct professor there, despite some of the tough audits I had of that university. And my daughter is a junior at Temple University, so I want to put that out there in full transparency. Um, it's important to note, and this is despite my strong disagreement with this, that none of these universities are inside of the state's right to know law, which to me is still somewhat incredible. When I was first elected to the state General Assembly, I served there for 3 terms. The legislature itself was not even part of the state's right to know law. I and many others who were bipartisan reform minded were able to get the state legislature included in the state's right to know law, but we were not able to even get Pitt, Penn State, and Temple included in that, which I still find that staggering. So I think that is one thing that should be considered, that they're not part of the state's right to know law. Broadly speaking, what does transparency mean? Look, I don't, sometimes you get this, do you really want to get into athlete and Penn State football playbooks and, what individual professors are doing on research? And the short answer is none of that is true. Most state universities across Pennsylvania and even across the country fall into their state's right to know law. It basically is an analysis of how you're using taxpayer dollars and whether the taxpayers are getting an investment back for their dollars. That would be, to me, what we would certainly would be a step forward in transparency for all of our state-related universities. And to various degrees, I was able to look at some of that, but not all of that, when I conducted the performance audit. But that's what I would view as being more transparent. It is not about looking at individual research before it is coming out. Obviously, universities, whether they be public or private, need some degree of professional, secrecy, for lack of a better word, until those results are finalized. And we're never looking at the individual professors, their health information, students, their private data. That stuff is always able to be protected, even if you're in the state's right to know law. But I think putting those universities in the state's right to know law would be a good step forward, I think, for those universities and for the public at large.
And Barry, what about you?
I'd like to focus a little more on accountability. And I have never had a case against Penn State. I have nothing against Penn State whatsoever. But when I heard what you read, its statement, it actually troubled me, because what they said is we're decentralized. First of all, they said they're decentralized. So in other words, there is no one really in charge. At least there's no one in charge of Title IX matters. There's no one who is setting the tone, who is holding what I'll say is middle level Title IX administrators accountable, making sure they're doing their job. So decentralized to me means we're not taking responsibility. And when they said that their policies and practices have grown organically, it sounded a little like bureaucratic speak. But again, what does grown organically mean? To me, what it sounds like is no one from the top had expertise and said, this is how we should handle things. This is what should happen when there are complaints that sound like Title IX complaints. This is how I expect everybody beneath me in this huge university to behave. There's no standards. So when they've grown organically, that sounds like we had a problem here. Let's put our finger in the dike. Okay, now we have a problem over there. Let's try to figure it out instead of being comprehensive. So it's actually a real concern that, to me, that statement really inadvertently told us about. At smaller institutions, I see similar things, although I thought that was a pretty direct statement by Penn State to that effect, that we don't have anyone on top making sure that Title IX and its regulations are complied with, and that victims of sexual assault or sexual discrimination are protected. So that was a concern. And that's, I guess, as of today.
Yeah, I mean, I should note that the university does have a Title IX coordinator and obviously an office. That is the statement they provided in response to the project. Eugene, in the introduction, and then when you were talking just before, you mentioned the performance audit that your office conducted of Penn State. Could you kind of describe the scope of the Penn State audit and some of the major findings that your office had?
Yeah, so look, when you're the auditor general, you don't have 10 million people working for you. So, we had to, pick our spots as to what we would look at, because Penn State is obviously an incredibly large university. And that's neither an inherent pro or con. That's just a reality that you had to pick your spot. So we really focused on a couple key areas that I believe were critical to look at. And there were two, what I viewed as troubling findings. One was that even post-Sandusky, we still found significant flaws in their background check system at some of their athletic camps, which, to be blunt, I was stunned that was still a flaw post-Sandusky. You would have thought if there was a university in the country that would have been incredibly focused on that, it would have been Penn State. And that doesn't mean that I found any specific issues related to that, but just the fact that they weren't doing the comprehensive background checks, I found troubling. The second one was that, and Penn State, I will, tell you, and it's included in the report, push back on this, but we feel very strongly about this, that that they were giving out-of-state students benefit over in-state students when it came to a close call on admissions to the university. So you have the idea of state investment into the university that should be helping in-state students, and Penn State being our flagship land grant university, that, look, as a Pennsylvanian, and my daughter's at Temple, I want them to be at a very diverse, well-rounded university. But if it's a close call, you also do believe that the Pennsylvanians should win the close call over someone out of state on getting admissions. We found the exact opposite at Penn State. And again, I want to be clear, the university pushed back on that, but we feel very strongly that we are right about that. Now, why do they do that? I don't think it's because they're out to destroy any kids' lives. I don't think that at all. I think it's because, and I pointed this out, that the legislature, starting in the mid-'80s, began a steady decrease in investments into our state-related universities, and even to some degree our state-owned universities, which eventually impacted the running of those universities to the point where I think they need the out-of-state tuition to continue to meet their budgetary issues. So I'm giving you the reason why I believe they did it, but I also think it's wrong that it's happening. You can blame the legislature, blame the university, whole other factors, and we can debate that going forward. But we feel very strongly that that was an issue that we found in the audit. So those were the two biggest findings that we found in that audit. And I think I am not sure where they stand on the background checks. They did say they were going to clean that up. Obviously, I'm not in office anymore, so I don't have the ability to enforce that right now. I'd be shocked if they've made any headway on the in-state issue with tuition, especially considering that I think recently the legislature voted out funding for Penn State, Temple, and Lincoln University, and I'm not aware of any means of changing that anytime soon.
Yeah, the funding for the state related has been flat the last couple of years, or small increases. And I know Penn State has made the argument that while on paper it gets the biggest amount of money, their denominator, when you break it up for in-state students, kind of makes it the last of the state relateds in per student funding.
Yeah, and look, you can get into a nitpick issue of whether that is technically accurate or not. But broadly speaking, our universities in the state do have a very legitimate argument on their investments not matching what happens in other states. There's no question about that. But to me, there's a win-win here. Go into the state's right to know law, and in exchange for that, get more state investment. I mean, I'd like, I know that's easier said than done, but I think that's the win-win here.
In the investigation that Spotlight PA and the Center Daily Times did, we mentioned a report that was published in 2020 by the U.S. Department of Education that focused on Penn State's Title IX policies. Just so people know, Title IX bars discrimination on the basis of sex. The U.S. Department of Education found that Penn State failed to ensure reliable and impartial investigations of complaints, and failed to provide reasonable timeframes for the complaint process. The department also said that in one academic year, Penn State did not maintain the records necessary to show whether the university was in compliance with the law. Barry, as a lawyer that's touched on Title IX cases, could you talk a little bit about the basics of Title IX and how it applies to universities, as well as your work?
Sure. So Title IX, as you said, bars discrimination based on sex in education. And by the way, that's not just colleges and universities, but that's high schools, middle schools, elementary schools, up and down the education ladder. So there are multiple types of discrimination that it affects. My primary focus has to do with sexual assaults. So just as an example, if a person, and it could be a man or a woman, is sexually assaulted in school, obviously it's a very traumatic event, and they can be re-traumatized by being exposed to their assaulter by various other means. And the law requires each educational institution to have a Title IX coordinator so that they can make their complaint, and that Title IX coordinator can basically protect them, give them supportive measures, depending on the severity of what happened. There can be all kinds of internal hearings within the school, but the school has to protect that person so that the person is not deprived of the benefits of their education. And education can mean classes, it can mean living in a dorm, it can mean sports. It's the full gamut of what educational institutions offer. So that's the basics of Title IX. The actual statute is very, very short, but there are a large number of regulations governing schools' obligations. It's more than we could cover today. And they're constantly changing, and that's actually a very interesting topic. If we have time today, I'd love to discuss.
Yeah, well, in your work, what kind of problems have you seen when you look at multiple universities? Are there kind of trends that you're seeing with Title IX and the implementation and how they handle those complaints?
I'm seeing that sometimes schools have good written Title IX policies, because you can probably find a good written policy on Google in 2 minutes. The real policy is, however, how it's implemented, how the Title IX coordinator and others in the Title IX office are trained. And even beyond that, the culture of the Title IX office, because culture matters. So I have a case where presumably the Title IX coordinator, instead of believing when, in a case I have, a young female victim came in and was explaining the terrible sexual harassment, was accusing that person. It's like we read about in criminal matters where rape victims are being accused of your skirt was too short. And again, this is culture. The Title IX office and officers need to have a culture of enforcing Title IX and protecting victims. And that does not mean being unfair or being one-sided, but it does mean understanding the law, understanding their obligations, and being sensitive to them.
Yeah, and especially with Title IX cases, when it is a very sensitive subject, what are the kind of challenges in bringing lawsuits involving Title IX when you're trying to protect identities and sensitive situations, but also kind of get to the truth of the matter?
The best result is no lawsuit at all. The best result is a victim comes to the Title IX office. The Title IX office does everything appropriately, protects that person, makes whatever accommodations are needed so that that person is not deprived of the benefits of their education. If that means moving an assaulter from one dorm to another, that should be done. If it means moving, making sure that assaulter and victim are not in the same classes, that should be done. The ideal situation is the school handles it correctly and promptly, because prompt matters. And there's never a lawsuit, and I never hear about it. That is how it should be. It's when things go wrong that I hear about it. And then, unfortunately, my job is to look at what happened and what should have happened, and that's when lawsuits happen, and especially when a student has been deprived of his or her benefits of education. A lot of times victims drop out of school because they're not being protected. And that's a disaster for that person and for society.
And when you talk about the leaders of Title IX offices and the training, is there oversight of those offices beyond the college or university? And what does that oversight look like? And how can people who file reports of misconduct be sure that their reports are reviewed and taken seriously?
Well, I'm going to answer that in two parts. Yeah. The oversight for what it is the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights. And anyone can make a complaint to that office. And the office's powers include investigating and, in certain situations, depriving the educational institution of federal funds. That doesn't help so much the victim. But what really should be happening, so in answer to I think the more pertinent question about how can victims, someone who comes to the Title IX office, make sure that things are going right, I'm going to use an analogy. We've probably all heard for ourselves or a family member in healthcare, you have to be your own advocate. You have to be your own advocate. Make sure the doctor is looking at the records. Make sure you're getting the right tests. Make sure the right doctor is reading the test results. Be your own advocate. Well, I would say the same thing in this situation, in an educational situation. You don't hear back from the Title IX officer, call back. Have a parent call back. You say, I want to see the writings. Now, when I say this is not a great remedy because we're already talking about people who are victims, who have a lot on their plate, are taking classes, are busy, are scared, may have been sexually assaulted. And it's an added burden. And ideally, they shouldn't have to do that. Practically, they frequently do. And I don't have a great solution for that, except slowly, steadily holding colleges, universities, and other schools accountable so that they are sufficiently nervous that they say, you know what, we need to have a really competent Title IX office so that these things don't happen and we don't get sued anymore. Mm-hmm. But in the short run, all I can say is be your own advocate.
And we've mentioned how Penn State is one of the state-related universities, along with Pitt, Temple, and Lincoln. Eugene, your office, as you mentioned, has done performance audits or did performance audits on several of the state relateds. What kind of common themes did you find in looking at multiples of these? And was there anything that was unique about Penn State?
So, two things. One, well, three. One is just to reiterate again, none of them are in the state's right to know law, which I still find amazing, but that is obviously consistent, but not a finding in the audit because we knew that going in. One thing that was pretty consistent so Penn State, we talked about the background checks. Also in our performance audit at the University of Pittsburgh, we found a very similar finding there. Not necessarily to the same degree at Temple, but Pitt and Penn State, we found very similar on the background check. The second thing, and I don't have the most current stats, but again, I would be shocked if we're not that far off. That is for in-state tuition. I think this is important for people to realize. For in-state students, in-state tuition, Pitt and Penn State, when the audits were done, were first and third in the nation, not in a good way, for cost to students from Pennsylvania to go to Pitt and Penn State. So Pitt was the most expensive public university for an in-state student to go to in the United States, and Penn State was third. That is, to me, a broader concern that, and I think these are great universities, I want to be clear, that there is a broader concern about pricing middle class and working class families in Pennsylvania out of the ability of going to these universities, because unlike some of the smaller liberal arts schools that or maybe even larger private schools that have larger endowments, the Pitt and Penn State's world, unless you're an athlete, and even then it's probably basketball and football where this really applies, maybe wrestling at Penn State, where you can get relatively large athletic scholarships. Minus that, if you're an in-state student, you're going to be either paying for that out of pocket or taking out a loan. And I think that is the consistent theme. Temple's done a better job, although the increases are going on there as well. But I think a consistent theme was the background checks at Pitt and Penn State and the cost to in-state students, which is very troubling, both currently and if the trend line continues.
And I guess we mentioned the right to know law several times. Could you define that, and then maybe again talk about how it can be used for transparency and kind of the misconceptions that people might have when they
So I'll start off with the easiest way to think about it, and that is you do have access to state tax dollar information even when you're not in the state's right to know law. But being in the state's right to know law means the presumption is on the taxpayer or the Pennsylvanian. So when I say taxpayer, it could be someone, could be to be blunt, a young person who may not be paying any individual tax at that point. But the presumption is the Pennsylvanian has access to the record, and then the university would have to show through the state's open records office that no, this is something that is protected. So the presumption is on the benefit of the Pennsylvanian in seeking that information. That's the biggest benefit for transparency and being in the state's right to know law. What does it not cover? Again, if you're doing research on how to cure some disease and that research is not ready for prime time yet, that is something that is not revealed. Students' healthcare record, not revealed. Professors, staff, healthcare record, addresses, home addresses, certainly protected. You can protect private, the email addresses, even if it's work. There are a lot of protections in there, and just because I have to say it, because I think it is somewhat comical, that because even though I'm a Pitt person and a Pitt fan, there was somebody that was accusing me of trying to hurt Penn State's ability to recruit a quarterback by being in the state's right to know law, which I thought was actually pretty laughable, because at the time, Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, Russell Wilson, Eli Manning were all, I think, the all-pro quarterbacks at the time when that question came, and they were all in the state's right to know law when they were in college. So yes, you can recruit a good quarterback even if you're in the state's right to know law, if anyone is concerned about that.
And one of the other things that was in that 2017 performance audit was the Ethics Act for the state. I want to kind of mention why that why you thought that was important?
So yeah, the Ethics Act I think is important because some of these items, I want to be clear, are not criminal. We're not talking about trying to put people in prison for, some for making a mistake on how you perform these jobs. I mean, some of these items again are not criminal. They are misuse of taxpayer dollars, but they are not public theft. And so the reason why the Ethics Act is important is that it's a way of public accountability beyond just the Auditor General pointing something out, but pointing something out, then the ability to make the change through the Ethics Act, perhaps a fine, some type of hearing where someone is held accountable through some public means without the idea of putting someone in prison. So to me, a lot of these things are items where, even if I strongly disagree, we're not talking about putting someone in prison. We're talking about there should be a level of public accountability, and that public accountability is best done through the Ethics Act.
Yeah, and Barry, you've talked about the culture and creating cultures. And one thing that came up in the reporting of our project is that in the past 10 years, Penn State has commissioned several surveys to kind of gauge employees and students' feelings about the university, these kinds of systems for reporting misconduct, as well as values and culture. The 2017 version of the survey found that less than half of faculty and less than half of staff at Penn State believe the university does not retaliate against people who report wrongdoing. And then the latest version of the survey came out about a week or a couple of weeks ago, and that found that nearly 40% of Penn State employees believe that those who violate university policies get rewarded. And it also, again, found that less than half of faculty and staff believe that Penn State does not retaliate against people who report misconduct. So I guess I'm curious, Barry, how you sort of think about the steps that institutions or individuals can take to build a different culture or trust in these systems that kind of have to function in order to protect students, employees, people in the community.
I'm going to give you an example of one of my cases.
Mm-hmm.
I have a case, we've been talking about Penn State, but the other state institutions are the ones under PASHE, Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. And it has 14 institutions in the state. There was a high-level administrator at one of the schools who was kicked out for his treatment of women. And then, a couple of years later, hired as president of one of the other universities, without regard to what had happened before. And it was very knowable. And then within the new school, there was a report by his executive secretary that he was sexually harassing her. She went to a dean, and they went to the Title IX office. And what happened? The dean was drummed out of the school, and the president who had done that was then, when there were consolidation of 3 of the universities, is now president of 3 of the universities. So, and this is an ongoing lawsuit that's actually scheduled for trial in January. And so if you went to that school, if a student went to that school, if a professor at that school said, I have a Title IX type thing to report, whether it's about me or about someone I know, should I do it? I know what happened to that other dean. So when I talk about the culture of an institution, that event helps define the culture of that institution and is a very clear message: just shut up. So I think that the opposite culture needs to be very clearly communicated in all schools, that whistleblowers or victims will not be retaliated against. We can't guarantee what a result of an investigation will be, but we can guarantee there will be no retaliation. And so at this particular school, there was severe retaliation, and it goes up to PASHE, Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education. So that sends the larger message to all of the PASHE schools that we will not stand behind someone who reports Title IX violations. Instead, we will stand behind, in this case, it was a harasser, but we will stand behind the institution and not the victims. And we'll take great steps to do that. It really tells victims and their advocates just to shut up. And that's the culture that needs to be changed. And when I said earlier, what can be done to change it? I say, it only comes to me when things go wrong. And obviously this is a situation where things went wrong. And we need, within a federal Title IX civil lawsuit, to make them accountable and to really hurt them so that they say, maybe we screwed up here. Maybe we should do things differently. And that's my goal.
And Eugene, I want to get your insights on changing culture too, but I do want to mention that we're kind of wrapping up with the questions I had. So people in the audience, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat and then we'll get to them. But Eugene, I'm curious for your thoughts about kind of changing cultures or building trust in these types of systems.
Look, these are large institutions. Changing cultures is a challenge, and it is possible. I do think that one of the things that's important is for the example to be set at the top, but also to be followed by the top, and not the practice of do what I say, not what I do. I think that when you have a clear distinction between, especially these larger universities, between administration and faculty and students, and not feeling that they're all on the same side, I think that's a problem. So I think for the administration, I think it's important not only to have some of these. Now, I want to be clear, a lot of these universities have very good policies on paper, but then you have to follow through. And when someone makes a mistake or does something wrong, they have to be held appropriately accountable for that. And when there's people that are in positions of power that are able to get away with that, then I think that hurts the institution as a whole. And I also want to be clear about this, that even when there's mistakes university-wide, that doesn't mean that great things aren't happening in the classroom or at the research level. These universities are doing great research, great things for students every single day. But culturally, they can all be better by having better practices that follow what's actually on paper. And I think that's the most important thing. I think a lot of universities today have very good policies. And when I did my investigations on Pitt, Penn State, and Temple, and including the state-owned universities, I didn't find policies that were bad. I found implementation of those policies that were wrong. And I think, just to follow up on some of Barry's comments, we found, again, this was now several years ago, but the state university system itself had a very good Title IX policy and very poor implementation of that policy throughout each of the state-owned universities throughout the system. So to me, it's not so much what is on paper. I think a lot of these schools have very good things on paper. It's about making sure that that is followed through university-wide, and that the administration can't be putting things down just because it's good for public perception, but they've got to buy into it as well.
Yeah, we had several audience questions relating to the project or just in general. One from Jennifer asking, you mentioned reaching out to university leadership to take part, and asking, were you able to reach out to specific resources on campus facilitating prevention efforts? Yeah, for the project, we did reach out to the university and asked to be able to speak to people who were in charge of the ethics office and kind of some of these compliance organizations. The university did not grant us interviews in order to be on the record for the story. Obviously, I try to have as many conversations with people who are involved in these types of things at the university. The university did not grant any of those types of interviews to us. And then we had another question about the statement that I read at the beginning. That was like the general statement in response to kind of all of our findings. So throughout our reporting process, over several months, we had some back and forth with the university, kind of asking them specific questions, things that we couldn't find on our own. And then after we kind of wrapped up those questions, we provided the university what we would call like a no surprises letter or a summary of findings, basically saying these are all the bits of information and the facts that we're going to include in the article, and giving them a while to respond. If they could respond to any, all of it, none of that. So the university, that statement that I read was in response to kind of the summary findings. And then there were specific parts of the story that the university chose to respond to. And we included that in the project, kind of in the places that were relevant. So I encourage you to read it. And there are other parts the university either didn't comment on or said it couldn't comment on. So I just want to make that clear. So yeah, there are parts that the university did respond specifically to, but that statement was kind of an overarching in response to the entire project. And I know, Barry, you mentioned the changes in Title IX and how things can shift. And I know some people might not realize that those parts of the law or the policy shift kind of depending on who is in charge in Washington, D.C. Could you talk a little bit about those
Sure.
changes coming down the pike?
Sure. So just as a little historical context, Title IX was not utilized for a long time. And in 2011, when President Obama was the president, the Department of Education sent out what was called the Dear Colleague letter, which basically said to all the colleges and universities, we take Title IX seriously and you better too. Now figure out some good procedures. But they didn't give procedures. They just said, you better take it seriously. And then it was kind of like the Wild West. Every school had different procedures. Some were good, some were bad. And a lot of people felt that this was really unfair, that there was a presumption against anyone accused of something, typically against a male who was accused of some kind of a sexual assault, that they didn't get a fair shake. When President Trump became president and he had a different Department of Education secretary, they set out very specific rules, and procedures, not unlike rules in court. And what I'll call the plaintiff's Title IX bar hated them. I and another lawyer I work with, I think, are the only two in the country who like those procedures. Because I do believe in fairness. I do believe in fairness, but we have a new administration, and I'm not criticizing our new administration at all, but there is a push to change back a lot of the rules, so that the big push is so that in internal hearings within schools, that the accused or his advocate or attorney cannot cross-examine the victim. And most Title IX lawyers think that this re-traumatizes the victims. And there's something to be said for that. I believe that in the interest of fairness, there has to be cross-examination so we can have trustworthiness in results and fairness. So this is the change that's anticipated that many Title IX lawyers are looking forward to, and I am not. And as further background for me, one of the defenses, almost common now, is to intimidate the victims. So to countersue them within the school, to countersue their family, to countersue their friends, to add so much pressure that the victim just throws up her hands and says, forget it, I drop everything. Or I'll drop out of school, leave me alone. When there are very specific, clear rules, very much like court rules, that can become illegal, that kind of intimidation defense. And so we have a pending lawsuit, I believe the first in the nation, targeting a lawyer who did that and his client And so far, we've been successful. Changing rules won't change that lawsuit, but could make that type of lawsuit unavailable in the future and could encourage this intimidation tactic that we're seeing across the board. So now, I'm the vast minority of plaintiffs' Title IX lawyers, victims' Title IX lawyers, who like the old rules, the current rules, and not what I'll call the more loosey-goosey rules. So this is what is up in the air right now. What will the Department of Education do, and how will they change the rules?
Yeah, we have a question from Eric that's kind of along those lines. Eric's asking that both of you have acknowledged that there's the drafting of the policies or what's on the page and then the implementation. And Penn State was obligated to respond kind of in the post-Sandusky era, but seemed less effective in handling the results. Eric was wondering, could it be that institutions are just not fully prepared in a practical sense to deal with the pending issues they discover or uncover? And the remedies can be expensive, but the lack of remedy is far worse. And Eric is asking, what would make Penn State or other institutions more effective going forward?
Well, I'd like to start there. The answer is it's not just Penn State. Following the Sandusky scandal, Pennsylvania itself updated a lot of its child protection laws, and a lot of those laws were very good. And as someone who's myself not only a former public official, but at the time I was an American Legion baseball coach, a lot of us, that previously didn't have to go through background checks, then had to, et cetera. As someone who's running the team now, someone selling hot dogs in the hot dog stand, they had to go through background checks. And again, a lot of that, I supported. Here was the problem. Even at the Department of Human Services, when I did an investigation of what is called Childline, it's the child abuse hotline, we found through the Corbett and Wolf administration 58,000 unanswered phone calls. Because following the law, the concern I was getting from advocates, families, et cetera, is yes, all these laws on the books, but people are calling in with these concerns, and then no one's even picking up the phone calling back. So I make that point just so now, obviously that raised a lot of alarms in the administration at that time. It was the Wolf administration. I traveled across the state working with child welfare advocates, and I know the system is better today. I want to be clear, not perfect, but better. But so the reason I say that is that was the state system specifically created to deal with potential child abuse phone calls, and 58,000 of them were not answered, and nobody disputed the number.
So what I'll say is that obviously is awful, and that is a difference between having a good policy and a culture of meaning it, of following the policy. And whether it's that the state didn't fund it or that there wasn't sufficient leadership within Childline, it's a perfect example of good policy, good written policy, good written law, and bad implementation. And bad implementation is a matter of bad culture.
And we had another question from Karen asking where the Board of Trustees is in all of this. I think Karen's referring to the Penn State Board of Trustees. One of the interesting things about our project is the ethics office. That was kind of a central point of that. Other ethics offices at other universities, such as the University of California system or Virginia Commonwealth University, do public reporting out of their ethics office. So they say every year, every academic year, we received, let's say, for example, 100 cases of alleged misconduct. 30% of those were harassment, 20% were people filing wrong financial information, for example. And they would put out those types of reports. They might say, within 10 days of receiving a complaint, we had someone who followed up, and these were the outcomes, in a way that doesn't necessarily identify people that can kind of tell the public this is how the ethics office works. These are our standards. These are our reporting outcomes. Penn State doesn't do any of that type of public reporting. The university said that the board of trustees gets those types of reports or something similar, but those reports are presented in private gatherings of the board of trustees and the specific committee that oversees them. Though I will say that the current Penn State administration has mentioned that doing some sort of public reporting is on the table, and that is something they're looking into.
The only thing I maybe for me to add here is that specifically in the Penn State audit, there must have been some type of division in the board, because some of the board members actually joined me at my press conference announcing the findings in support of the audit, while there were obviously some board members in the administration as a whole that, pushed back on some of it. So, and overall, that's just, I think, a concern when there's that type of division in the board, period. We did not have that same issue at Temple and Pitt.
Yeah, and John had a question about the state role in Title IX. So John was asking, has the state set Title IX policy guidance for the state-supported universities that is effective? And if so, could that guidance be directed at the state-related schools?
To the best of my knowledge, it has been up to the universities, both private and public and state-related, to develop their own in accordance with federal law. I do not believe the legislature that I'm aware of or the governor has specifically weighed in on those policies. If they have, I'm just not aware of it. But I believe that each of those universities is doing it on their own, and the state-related university or the state-owned universities in accordance with the PASHE administration. That's a pretty consistent model, but I think the state-related and the privates are doing it on their own in accordance with federal law.
I think that's right. I will say that there is a very, very underutilized Pennsylvania law administered by the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, concerning discrimination in education. But it is virtually unknown to lawyers. And if you look at any case law, you don't see any case law referring to it. So I'd like that law developed a little bit, but ultimately the better enforcement would be not through lawsuits, but really through appointment of appropriate people within PASHE, within the boards, who care about this and can start from the top up, creating a culture that values Title IX and values sending appropriate messages to the staff and student body.
And we'll wrap up with one more audience question. Nick is asking, why hasn't the Pennsylvania legislature been able to pass any laws widening the scope of the right to know range for these public schools? And what are some things that people can do in that area to keep the conversation going?
It's frustrating. So I think the best thing to do is keep contacting your legislator and keep asking them to do this. I do believe that this is one of the areas that is now being raised as a concern that they're not in. And some legislators are saying that for them to continually support funding for these universities, this is something they want in exchange for that. I don't want to speak on behalf of those legislators, but I have read those statements. And so I think it's important just to keep pressing, but it has always been a mystery to me how this has not been taken care of.
Great. Well, I know we're coming up on 7 o'clock, so I just want to thank Barry and Eugene for your time and obviously insights on these topics, and thank everyone for tuning in. You can find more of events like these that Spotlight puts on at www.spotlightpa.org/topics/events. And you can find our list of events there, and get more information on things like this. So Barry, Eugene, thank you very much for spending time with us this evening.
Thanks, Wyatt. Thanks for
Thank you,
having us.
Wyatt.